You may have watched sci-fi films set in space and noticed that in some scenes, people walk as if gravity is still present. Whether it's explained or simply implied, this effect is known as artificial gravity. Artificial gravity is a simulation of gravitational forces aboard a space vehicle in orbit or on its way to another planet. Now, although it behaves like gravity, artificial gravity is not gravity in the traditional sense. It's actually an inertial force, a result of acceleration, but it acts on the body in a way that is virtually indistinguishable from real gravity on Earth. But you might be asking, what's the need for artificial gravity? Well, it plays a critical role in protecting astronaut health. Extended time in microgravity environments leads to muscle and bone loss, cardiovascular weakening, sensory motor disruption, and hormonal imbalances. These effects pose serious challenges for long-duration missions, especially those heading to Mars or beyond. Artificial gravity is one of the few solutions that can address all of these issues simultaneously, making it not just useful but potentially essential for the future of human space travel. When watching a film or series, it can be hard to stifle the thought of how close we are in the present to what you're seeing. And in this video, I will explore which depiction of artificial gravity in film and television is the most feasible according to our current scientific research. Now, although there are plenty of sci-fi films to potentially analyze, I have chosen 4 which cover a broad range of methods as well as from different time periods. These are Interstellar, 2001: A Space Odyssey, The Expanse, and Star Wars. And to help my decision, I will also be using a rating system, giving each a score on a variety of different factors.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
Now let's start with the classic, 2001: A Space Odyssey. In 2001, the film's rotating modules create the gravity that characters walk on. The film uses rotation to create a centrifugal force that the occupants experience as gravity. Centrifugal acceleration is the inertial acceleration produced by circular motion. This acceleration is given by the equation acceleration equals omega squared r. In a rotating habitat, every object is pushed radially outwards so that the inhabitants standing at the rim feel this force as downward gravity. Here's where we can implement our first score, scientific accuracy. The physics is conventional Newtonian dynamics and is well documented in human factors and engineering literature. But how does the Space Station V in 2001: A Space Odyssey compare to this? Now, from the film alone, it's very hard to determine the size of Space Station V, but many public sources estimate Space Station V to be approximately 300 meters in diameter, leading to a radius of 150 meters. We can also figure out the rotation frequency of the space station. Using frame-by-frame timing, we can measure that a quarter of rotation occurs in about 9 seconds, meaning a full rotation occurs in 36 seconds. We can work out the rotation frequency and use this to work out the angular velocity. And using both our measurements for the radius and angular velocity, we can work out that the acceleration experienced on Space Station V is approximately 0.7 g. At 0.47 g, occupants could walk rather comfortably. Now let's go over the pros and cons of Space Station V. Now, one of the first pros is that it's grounded in well understood physics. Another pro would be that it can provide continuous gravity without constant fuel consumption due to the conservation of angular momentum. And another pro would be that it has a large radius, which reduces the gravity gradient and Coriolis effects. Now let's move on to the cons. The first being the structural and construction challenges for a very large rotating habitat. Think about how difficult it would be to construct this in space. And another being that Coriolis forces and gravity gradients will still exist. Now, moving on from the pros and cons, we can also work out the energy required to spin the space station up to a sufficient rate. If we approximate the mass to be 200,000 kilograms, which is a fairly conservative guess, as the International Space Station is 420,000 kilograms, we can use this equation to work out the kinetic energy when the space station is spinning, therefore the energy required to spin it up. Plugging the numbers in gives us about the amount of energy as half a gallon of jet fuel. Now this relatively low figure is quite advantageous, because once rotated, maintaining spin requires little ongoing energy in a vacuum. The major cost is really only the launch and assembly. What about the materials? Well, a 300-meter ring has significant tensile stresses during rotation. Materials must handle centripetal loads, fatigue, and dynamic stresses. Modern high-strength alloys and composites improve feasibility, but again, transporting and assembling the required mass is quite hard. So this leads us to our second score, technological feasibility. This method is physically sound and spin-up energy is quite modest. The main barriers are the mass, the materials, and the large-scale orbital construction. Therefore, I think it's fair to say it gets a score of 7.5 out of 10. Now let's move on to linear acceleration in the expanse. In the expanse, the Epstein drive is presented as a high-efficiency, high-thrust fusion engine that allows continuous linear acceleration for long durations. But how does linear acceleration work? Well, when the ship accelerates at a rate A, every mass inside experiences a force opposite to the direction of thrust. This feels like gravity as long as the acceleration is sustained. Based on this method, we can give it a scientific accuracy score. The physics principle is simple Newtonian dynamics and fully accurate, therefore I think it's fair to say it gets a 9 out of 10, which is the same score as the centrifugal acceleration. So how does the Epstein drive compare to this theoretical picture? While the show never gives a complete technical breakdown, supplementary material and fan documentation describe it as a compact, ship-mounted fusion reactor contained in a magnetic bottle. In the lore, fuel pellets are injected into the chamber and ignited by high-energy lasers with powerful electromagnetic fields containing the resulting plasma and directing it into a thrust. The system achieves an unprecedented balance of fuel efficiency and thrust output, allowing weeks or months of sustained acceleration, something far beyond any propulsion technology available today. Crucially, it delivers this performance in a compact package small enough to fit on vessels ranging from cargo ships to warships, without massive radiators or power plants dominating the design. Following this, let's explore how technologically feasible this is. In the present, there are 3 candidates which are similar to the technology used in the expanse. The first being direct fusion drive, which is private research, which is an approach under investigation that couples fusion to direct thrust. Another is advanced fusion concepts, like magno-inertial and aneutron ideas, which are currently speculative. And the last being nuclear thermal propulsion, in which high ISP concepts exist but do not yet deliver the combination of high thrust and long duration operation depicted in the show. Another barrier that must be overcome to be technologically feasible would be the thermal and radiation management. A mobile high-power fusion engine would generate extreme heat and radiation. Shielding and heat rejection in a small ship are major engineering hurdles. And another problem would be the structural and material considerations. Long continuous thrust produces sustained loads on structure and payload. While rockets endure high accelerations, the difference in the expanse is long-duration sustained acceleration, repeated mission cycles, and high delta-V budgets. Based on all these factors, I think it's fair to give the expanse a technological feasibility score of 6 out of 10. This is mainly because the underlying physics is sound, but the engineering, like the compact sustained fusion, the heat and radiation shielding, as well as the long-living components, is what is holding it back. Now let's move on to centrifugal gravity in Interstellar. In Interstellar, artificial gravity is implemented aboard the Endurance, the rotating spacecraft at the heart of the film's journey. Its purpose is to serve as the main interplanetary transport vehicle for the crew's mission through the wormhole, carrying life support, scientific equipment, and living quarters for extended deep space travel. Artificial gravity is used here for the same reason as in other realistic space depictions, to ensure the crew can function over long durations without debilitating effects of microgravity, allowing them to work, move, and live as they would on Earth. Like 2001: A Space Odyssey, the Endurance generates artificial gravity via centrifugal acceleration, using its rotating habitat ring to simulate down through inertia. Because the method is identical in principle to that seen in 2001 and is fully grounded in real physics, it earns the same scientific accuracy score of 9 out of 10. The main question is whether the film's specific depiction matches up to the numbers. The film's production and design notes list the Endurance's wheel diameter as approximately 64 meters and a rotation rate of 5.6 rpm. Using those figures directly produces an apparent acceleration above 1g if measured at the very outer radius, but the 64-meter figure is only the outer diameter. If you account for the structural depth and internal arrangement, the effective radius to the crew floor reduces by a few meters, which brings the apparent gravity down to approximately 1g given the rotation rate. But what about the spin-up energy? Well, the energy requirement for a habitat ring of this size is far lower than for a 300-meter station, making the energy demands manageable with existing chemical or electric thrusters. Another positive about the small ring diameter compared to 2001's massive space station V is that the Endurance is less structurally demanding to build. But we can't forget about the cons. The smaller radius means higher rotation rates to achieve the same amount of gravity, which would increase the potential for Coriolis effects and slight gravity gradients, which would be slightly more uncomfortable than on Space Station V. The film also gets another small win in terms of radiation shielding. Dense systems like water and primary life support are placed between the crew and space, which helps reduce cosmic ray and solar particle exposure. With all this information, I think it's time to assign Interstellar a technological feasibility score. Given that the Endurance's compact, integrated approach is more realistic in the nearer term, as well as the lower spin-up energy and construction complexity, as well as the excess shielding, I feel Interstellar deserves a slightly better score than 2001: A Space Odyssey, giving Interstellar a score of 8 out of 10. Now let's move on to our last film, Star Wars. In the Star Wars universe, gravity is presented as an effortless, ship-wide property. Crew walk on decks as if Earth's gravity were always present and localized, regardless of whether the ship is spinning or accelerating. This is usually explained in the fiction as the result of onboard gravity generators or gravity plating. Now, what's being suggested by this gravity plating on screen is not rotation or acceleration, but a device that directly produces a gravitational-like force inside compartments. From the physics side, two broad classes of non-rotational mechanisms are sometimes suggested in science fiction and pop science. The first being large-scale electromagnetic or diamagnetic systems, and the second being light-based manipulation. Current literature notes that magnetic or diamagnetic techniques can create levitation effects on tiny objects, for example levitating a frog, but scaling this to people would require enormous superconducting magnets and cryogenics, a solution that is currently impractical. The other technique of light-based manipulation is based on a laboratory technique in the real world called optical tweezers. If we scale the physics, it shows the impossibility of using a light-based system to hold a human against gravity. Using the momentum transferred by light, the force from a beam relates to this equation. If we take Chewbacca, for example, who's approximately 112 kilograms, we can work out the power needed to support his weight. And this works out to hundreds of gigawatts. Just for reference, a large nuclear power plant produces 1 gigawatt of power. So based on these two methods, we can determine a scientific accuracy score. Neither of the two methods really hold up under current physics. The light-based theory that gravity is generated by photons is fundamentally flawed due to the large amount of power needed. The magnetic theory is equally problematic. Whilst magnetic fields can exert forces on ferromagnetic materials, the human body is largely non-magnetic, meaning such a system would not simulate gravity for most matter on board. Even if the strong magnetic fields could be used for certain components or equipment, they would be biologically hazardous to humans at the intensities required to produce a meaningful gravitational force. Consequently, based on what we know from physics, Star Wars Artificial Gravity earns a scientific accuracy score of 2 out of 10. So how do the films compare to this? We can definitely deduce that it is not centrifugal acceleration or linear acceleration at play. This leaves only the speculative non-inertial methods, such as the aforementioned gravity-plated, a concept occasionally hinted at in extended law. This strongly implies a technology that is not even theoretically supported in present-day physics. So this leads us to our technological feasibility score. I think it's fair to give Star Wars a 1 out of 10. The reason behind this would be the energy and heat rejection constraints from any light-based methods and the impossibly dangerous magnetic methods. When considering which depiction of artificial gravity in film and television is the most feasible according to our current scientific research, the scores and analysis make the answer clear. 2001: A Space Odyssey and Interstellar both achieve a scientific accuracy score of 9 out of 10 due to their use of centrifugal acceleration, a method grounded in well-understood physics and supported by real-world studies such as NASA's artificial gravity research and the Gemini 11 tether experiment. However, when technological feasibility is factored in, Interstellar's smaller, more compact Endurance station scores higher than the 2001's massive Space Station V, as its reduced scale, more efficient structural design, and realistic spin parameters make it a more achievable near-term engineering project. The expansive Epstein drive concept ranks highly for scientific accuracy in its linear acceleration approach, but present-day energy generation limitations severely reduce its feasibility. Star Wars' speculative gravity plating earns the lowest scientific accuracy score, as neither its light-based nor magnetic explanations align with current physics. Taken together, the analysis shows that Interstellar provides the most feasible depiction, not only matching known scientific principles, but also presenting a spacecraft whose design could plausibly be reached within the next century given foreseeable advances in materials, construction techniques, and space infrastructure.